Charles Pooter sat at his desk, staring at the blank page of his diary, his pen poised, waiting for the words to come. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the pen, an unusual feeling creeping over him. It wasn't that he had nothing to say. Rather, it was the overwhelming sense of his own mediocrity. What did his life amount to? What was there worth writing down? He had no great accomplishments, no grand adventures to recount, and yet, somehow, he felt compelled to write. He'd been keeping this diary for years, each entry a list of small, inconsequential events that, on the surface, seemed unremarkable. But to Charles, they were everything. His life, after all, was built on these small moments, the everyday details that made up the fabric of his existence. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, and then dipped his pen into the ink, finally beginning to write. Monday, 4th of April. A rather unremarkable day as usual. The weather was dull, the sky overcast, and I had the distinct pleasure of hearing Mrs. Pooter complain about the curtains once again. It seems that no matter how many times I try to explain that they are perfectly fine, she remains convinced that they need replacing. He paused, thinking for a moment. Was this worth recording? Did anyone care? But he had always thought of the diary as a place to document his life, even if it was mundane. He continued to write, the words flowing more easily now. Went to the office today. Another tedious day at the bank. Mr. Perkins asked me to look into the quarterly reports, which, of course, I did with my usual attention to detail. I do wish, however, that I could muster more enthusiasm for the work. Still, a man has to make a living. Charles sighed, setting the pen down for a moment. The truth was, he was growing tired of the daily grind. He had been working at the same bank for nearly 15 years, and though he'd been promoted a few times, it was always in the most mundane of ways. Nothing about his job made him feel alive. Nothing about it made him feel important. Yet, he had never taken the risk of leaving, of pursuing something different. The security of a steady income, the comfort of the routine, it was all too easy to stay where he was. Dinner was uneventful, he wrote, picking up the pen again. Mrs. Pooter prepared a rather dry chicken casserole, and young William, as usual, did not contribute to the conversation at all. He sat there with his nose buried in a book, as though the family dinner table was merely a place to eat, rather than to communicate. It's rather frustrating at times. I do wish he would engage with us, if only a little. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. William, his son, had always been an enigma. At 16, the boy seemed to live in his own world, distant and withdrawn, preferring the company of books and imaginary worlds to that of his own family. Charles couldn't help but wonder where he had gone wrong. Was it his fault? Was he too distant, too absorbed in his own mediocrity to notice his son slipping away from him? It bothered him more than he cared to admit. After dinner, I went for a short walk. He continued writing. A brief escape from the house, which feels smaller and smaller with each passing day. I walked to the park, and the evening air, while cool, was refreshing. I must admit, the park at dusk has a certain charm, and for a moment I felt something. A fleeting sense of peace, perhaps, or nostalgia for simpler times. He paused again, feeling the weight of his own words. Was this all he had to show for his life? A string of minor complaints and small observations? There was no adventure, no excitement. There was only the slow, steady march of time. The next day, Charles went to work again. He sat at his desk, as he had done countless times before, staring at the same spreadsheets, answering the same calls. It was as though nothing ever changed. His colleagues came and went, exchanging pleasantries and gossip, but it all felt so empty. He had become invisible in this place, just another cog in the machine. Work today was much like any other day, Charles wrote later that evening, though I did receive an unexpected visit from Mr. Green, who mentioned a new opportunity in the works for the department. It seems there's a chance for a promotion, but I can't shake the feeling that it would only bring more of the same, a bigger office, a better chair, but the same unremarkable work. He couldn't deny that the idea of promotion intrigued him. He had spent so many years in the same position that the thought of moving up was both exhilarating and terrifying. Would it really change anything? Would it give him the sense of fulfillment he so desperately craved? Or would it only serve to trap him in a bigger, more confining cage? Later that week, Charles attended a dinner party hosted by a colleague an event that was typical of the social circles in which he moved. He arrived on time, as always, dressed in his best suit, but he felt strangely out of place. The conversations were shallow, the laughter forced, and Charles found himself retreating into the corner, nursing his glass of wine and observing the others. They were all so much more polished, so much more confident than he could ever hope to be. "Dinner party was dull," he wrote in his diary the next morning. "I found myself lost in the crowd, unable to participate in the conversation. There's a particular couple, Mr. and Mrs. Turner, who always seem to dominate the discussion. Their stories, their adventures, their travels, it all sounds so exciting. I wonder if I could ever live such a life." He set the pen down, his mind drifting back to the evening. Mr. Turner had regaled them with tales of his travels to far-off places, his eyes sparkling with excitement as he spoke of his daring adventures. Charles had listened, envious of the man's confidence and his ability to captivate an audience. He could never do that. He had no stories to tell, no adventures to recount. What was his life, after all, if not a series of monotonous days strung together? As he sat in the quiet of his study, Charles felt a wave of frustration rise within him. Was this all he would ever be? A nobody. A man with no impact, no stories to share, no legacy to leave behind. He longed for something more, but he wasn't sure how to find it. The life he had built was safe, predictable, and comfortable, but it was also suffocating. The world outside seemed full of people living lives of excitement, of purpose, while he drifted through his own, like a leaf in the wind. And then, the realization hit him. He had been waiting for something to change, waiting for life to present him with an opportunity, a sign that he was meant for something greater. But perhaps it wasn't life that needed to change. It was him. He had to make a decision. He had to take a risk. The next morning, as he sat with his cup of coffee, he made up his mind. He wouldn't wait anymore. He wouldn't be a spectator in his own life. Whether it was through writing, traveling, or pursuing a new career, he would take control. He would stop being the nobody he had always been. Here was something different about the air when Lucy returned to her childhood home. It wasn't the house itself, which had remained untouched for years, standing tall on the hill, its windows gazing out over the valley. It was the feeling, something nostalgic, yet bittersweet, that seemed to hang in the air like a fog. The wind rustled the branches of the oak tree in the yard, and for a brief moment, Lucy could almost hear the echoes of her younger self laughing, running across the grass, chasing the cat, hiding in the shed with her brother Ethan. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed it until now, standing on the doorstep, key in hand, ready to open the door and step back into the past. The house had always been full of life when she was young. Her parents had been warm and welcoming, always hosting gatherings with family and friends. The scent of freshly baked bread and the sound of soft jazz playing in the background was a constant memory in her mind. But now, as she unlocked the door and stepped inside, the silence was deafening. The air felt stale, as though it had been waiting for her to return, to breathe life back into it. Lucy stepped cautiously into the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The walls, once adorned with family photos and artwork, were now bare, save for a few faded frames. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, and she shivered slightly, unsure if it was from the cold or the weight of the memories that seemed to flood back. The living room was the same as she remembered it, furniture arranged just so, the grand piano in the corner, its keys gathering dust. But it was different, too. There was no life in the room anymore. No laughter, no chatter, no sounds of someone humming a tune while they cleaned. Everything felt frozen, as though time had stopped when she left and hadn't started again until now. Lucy walked through the house, each room a snapshot of a different time in her life. She found herself standing in the kitchen, where her mother had always been, her apron on, stirring something on the stove or chopping vegetables for dinner. She could almost hear the soft clink of utensils, the murmur of conversation between her parents as they prepared meals together. It had been years since she had been here, years since her mother had passed away, and the absence was now palpable. Her eyes wandered to the small table in the corner, where she and Ethan used to sit for breakfast, fighting over the last pancake. The chairs were still pushed in, the table neatly set, as though the family would be back any moment. but they wouldn't. Not anymore. A sudden pang of loss hit Lucy's chest, and she had to sit down at the table, her hands clasped together in her lap. She had left the house when she went to college, seeking something more, something beyond the small town she had grown up in. And she had found it, a new life in the city, a career, friends, love. But with that came distance, both physical and emotional, from the place that had once been her home. Coming back now felt like stepping into a world that no longer existed, a world that had been left behind in the wake of her departure. But it wasn't just the house that had changed. It was her. She had changed. She was no longer the girl who had spent her days running through the fields, climbing trees, and playing hide-and-seek with Ethan. The girl who had watched her parents grow old, who had seen the house become quieter with each passing year. She had left and built a new life, and in doing so, had left parts of herself behind. As Lucy wandered through the house, she found herself in her old bedroom. The walls were still painted the same soft lavender, the bed still made up the way she had left it all those years ago. The desk was cluttered with old books and papers, some half-finished projects she had never completed. On the bookshelf were the same well-worn novels she had read over and over, their spines creased from countless readings. It was as if nothing had changed at all. But of course, everything had changed. The room was empty now. No posters on the walls, no clothes scattered across the floor, no homework left undone. The bed, still neatly made, seemed like a relic of another time. A time when she had lived here, when this was home. Her gaze drifted to the window, the view of the backyard just beyond. She could see the treehouse her father had built for her and Ethan all those years ago. It was still there, though the wood had faded and the ladder was now crooked. She remembered the many afternoons spent up there, playing games, telling stories, and escaping from the world below. It had been their fortress, their secret space. Lucy stood up and walked to the window, her fingers brushing against the sill. The years had changed so much, but some things, like the treehouse, remained. She had always thought that coming back would be like picking up where she left off, that the house would be the same, the people the same. But she realized now that time didn't work that way. Time didn't allow you to pick up the pieces of your past and put them back together. It moved forward, whether you were ready or not. As the evening sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow across the room, Lucy sat down on the bed, her head in her hands. She felt a deep longing, a connection to this place that she couldn't quite define. Home, sweet home, they called it. But what did home really mean? Was it the house, the memories? Or was it the people you loved, the family that had shaped you, the ones who had been part of your world before it all changed? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside the door. Lucy looked up to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his face lit by the soft light from the hallway. He had grown taller since she last saw him, and his once boyish features had been replaced by the face of a man. But there was no mistaking the familiar smile he gave her, the same smile they had shared in their childhood, full of warmth and affection. "You came back," Ethan said, his voice soft but filled with emotion. Lucy nodded, standing up to meet him. "I don't know why," she admitted, her voice shaking slightly. I needed to come back." Ethan stepped forward, his hands in his pockets. "You know, I've been thinking about this house a lot lately, about what it used to be. I don't think I ever really appreciated it until it was gone." Lucy smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Me neither," she whispered. For a moment they stood there in silence, the weight of the past settling between them. And then, without another word, Ethan reached out and pulled her into a hug. It was an embrace full of comfort, of understanding, of shared memories. In a small village by the edge of the jungle, there was a parrot unlike any other. His name was Kiko, and he wasn't just any parrot with a colorful plumage and the ability to mimic human speech. No, Kiko had a secret, one that the villagers had come to realize only after years of watching him move. Kiko practiced karate. It all began when the villagers first noticed him. At first, he was just another parrot, squawking loudly from his perch in the tree, mimicking the sounds of the village, cows mooing, children laughing, the sound of the blacksmith hammering his anvil. But one evening, as the sun began to set and the villagers gathered around the well, a strange sight caught their attention. Kiko, perched on a low branch, began to flap his wings furiously, but not in the chaotic, haphazard way parrots normally did. No, Kiko's movements were deliberate, precise, and filled with an energy that seemed different. At first, the villagers thought it was a game, a strange display of nature. But then Kiko performed a high kick, followed by a sharp spin that landed him perfectly on the branch. The villagers stopped in their tracks, staring, unsure if they had truly seen what they thought they had. Kiko turned his head to them, squawked proudly, and flapped his wings again, as though it were nothing unusual. The next day, the villagers couldn't help but gossip about the karate parrot. Some thought it was a fluke, just a funny coincidence, but others began to take notice. Kiko was not only repeating the same movements, but he was also getting better at it, executing high kicks, backflips, and even some basic kata that made him appear more like a martial artist than a bird. At first, it was amusing. The children would laugh and try to imitate him, but as the weeks went on, Kiko's movements grew sharper, more fluid, and somehow purposeful. One day, a wandering traveler passed through the village. He had heard stories of the parrot, of the bird that practiced karate. Skeptical, the traveler approached the villagers and asked, "Is it true that there's a parrot here who practices martial arts?" The villagers chuckled and nodded. "You've come to the right place," one of them said, pointing toward the large tree where Kiko often trained. "He's more than just a parrot. He's a karate master." The traveler, now intrigued, walked toward the tree, expecting nothing more than a curious show. But when Kiko saw him, something changed in the bird's demeanor. The playful energy shifted, and the parrot hopped down from his branch with the grace of a warrior preparing for battle. He stood tall, eyes sharp, and gave the traveler a challenge. Without saying a word, Kiko bowed low in the way a true martial artist would, inviting the traveler to engage. The traveler, taken aback, couldn't help but laugh. "You want me to fight you? A parrot?" he asked, amused. But Kiko didn't flinch. He performed a series of precise moves, each one faster and more controlled than the last. The traveler stood there, stunned, as Kiko began executing swift jabs, kicks, and blocks, his wings moving like a human martial artist's arms. The traveler, no longer laughing, raised his hands, trying to block an imaginary blow from Kiko. But Kiko was too fast. With a swift maneuver, the parrot spun, landed behind him, and tapped him lightly on the shoulder. The traveler was speechless. He had never seen anything like it. Kiko, the karate parrot, had just beaten him, all without a single word or gesture of aggression. The village quickly became known far and wide, not just for its beautiful surroundings, but for its karate parrot. People traveled from distant towns and villages to see the bird perform his amazing feats. Some came to watch, others to challenge him, but all left with the same sense of wonder. They came to see the parrot, but what they truly left with was the lesson that Kiko imparted without ever saying a word. The parrot taught them that true strength wasn't in size or appearance, but in the heart and determination to be the best version of oneself. As the years passed, Kiko's fame grew. He became somewhat of a legend, and soon, martial artists from all over the world sought to train with him. They wanted to learn from the bird who, with his small body and colorful feathers, could execute moves that few human martial artists could match. And Kiko, ever humble, welcomed them all. He would bow to them, demonstrate a perfect roundhouse kick, or break a small board with his beak, all while his wings moved in ways that mimicked the ancient movements of karate masters. But Kiko's heart was always with the village. He trained not for fame, but for the joy of perfecting his craft. He taught the children of the village, showing them the fundamentals of discipline, respect, and balance. In the mornings, the children would gather around the tree where Kiko practiced, watching him closely as he executed his moves. They would mimic him, laughing and stumbling at first, but with each day they grew stronger, their movements more precise, and their hearts more determined. One summer, a group of bandits passed through the village. They were known for terrorizing small towns, stealing food, and causing trouble wherever they went. When they arrived in the village, they found it unusually quiet, the villagers going about their work, seemingly unaware of the threat. The bandits, seeing this as an opportunity, began to ransack the village, stealing what they could and threatening the villagers. But Kiko wasn't about to let that happen. From his perch in the tree, he saw the commotion below. With a flurry of movement, Kiko launched himself into action. The bandits were too busy to notice the small, colorful bird descending from the tree, but when Kiko landed in front of them, his stance was clear. He bowed low, just as he always did before a fight, his wings poised like hands about to deliver the first strike. The bandits, laughing at the sight of the tiny parrot, stepped forward, not understanding the danger they were in. But Kiko moved with lightning speed. His wings became a blur as he ducked, weaved, and struck. With each kick, he knocked a bandit off balance. With each flap, he blocked their clumsy punches. The bandits, caught off guard by the ferocity of the little parrot, found themselves stumbling and falling, unable to keep up with Kiko's fluid, martial arts-inspired moves. Bahlol had always been an odd man, though his eccentricities were embraced by the people who knew him. He was the kind of person whose presence seemed to bring warmth to the coldest of rooms, yet who could disappear into the shadows of the night without leaving a trace. The town in which he lived was small, with only a few dozen families, and the residents often turned to Bahlol when they faced a challenge they couldn't solve. He wasn't a scholar nor a philosopher, yet his wisdom seemed to come from a place beyond the world that others understood. The first time I met Bahlol, I was a young boy, barely old enough to walk properly without tripping over my own feet. He had a small shop near the edge of the town, a collection of trinkets and oddments piled high, with a small sign that read, "Everything you need and more." People would come in with strange requests. Some wanted a missing button for their coat, others a key to an old chest that no longer opened. And yet, Bahlol always seemed to have what they were looking for. It wasn't that he had a vast collection of material possessions, but that he had the ability to find what others couldn't, no matter how impossible the task. One rainy afternoon, I wandered into his shop, seeking shelter from the storm. Bahlol was sitting behind the counter, his eyes closed as though in deep thought, though he was as alert as ever. His thick, gray beard, long and untamed, had a streak of white down the middle, and his clothes were threadbare from years of use. Despite his appearance, there was something about him that made people listen when he spoke. "Ah, the young one," Bahlol said with a smile when I stepped into the shop, his voice soft yet full of knowing. "I've been expecting you." I blinked, surprised. "Expecting me? How did you know I was coming?" Bahlol didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed to a small stool near the counter and motioned for me to sit. I obeyed, curious about what he meant. His eyes never opened as he spoke again. The world moves in ways that few truly understand. It has a way of guiding us to where we need to be, even if we don't know it ourselves. I sat there, listening as Bahlol continued, his words like a quiet river flowing around me. He told me stories of the world beyond the mountains, of travelers who came and went, of wisdom that couldn't be found in books or scrolls. And though he was never explicit, I felt that Bahlol knew something deeper, something that no one else in the town did. There was a sense of peace in his presence, as though all the world's chaos faded away when he spoke. Days turned into weeks, and I began visiting Bahlol more frequently. Each visit brought new revelations, new stories that would shape my understanding of the world. His lessons were never direct, never preachy, but always insightful, like a river slowly carving its path through a mountain. Sometimes we would sit in silence for hours, watching the world pass by, and I would leave with the feeling that I had learned something important, though I couldn't always put it into words. One day, a traveler arrived in town, a man who was clearly not from these parts. He was dressed in fine clothes, his boots polished, and he carried himself with an air of importance. The people of the town, curious about him, crowded around him, asking where he was from, what he had seen, and what brought him to their humble village. He spoke of distant cities, of riches and wonders beyond the horizon. But when he reached Bahlol's shop, he grew quiet, his eyes narrowing as if he had seen something that unsettled him. "I've heard of you," the traveler said, his voice low. "Bahlol, the wise fool." Bahlol smiled, unfazed by the insult. "Is that so? And what makes you think I am a fool?" The traveler laughed, the sound ringing harshly in the small shop. "Your reputation precedes you. They say you have answers to every question, yet your answers make no sense. You confuse the wise with your riddles and speak in parables that lead nowhere. How can a fool like you be considered wise?" Bahlol's eyes twinkled as he leaned forward, his voice calm. Ah, but you see, my friend, the world itself is full of riddles, and only those who seek with an open heart will find the answers they truly need. Wisdom is not about knowing everything, it's about knowing what matters. The traveler scowled, clearly frustrated. And what matters then, Bahlol? Bahlol looked out the window, as though searching for something in the distance. What matters, he said softly, is that we stop looking for answers in the wrong places and start listening to what the world is trying to tell us. The traveler, still unconvinced, left Bahlol's shop soon after, muttering under his breath. But Bahlol's words stayed with me. There was something profoundly true in them, something that had the power to shift the way I viewed the world. As I grew older, I began to understand Bahlol more deeply. His eccentricities were not the result of madness or folly. They were the marks of someone who had seen beyond the surface of life and had learned to embrace its mysteries. Bahlol never sought wealth or recognition. He lived simply, but with a richness that could not be measured in gold or jewels. One summer, when I had grown into a young man, the town faced a great hardship. The crops had failed, and the villagers were hungry. Desperation filled the air, and people began to argue, blaming one another for the misfortune. The town council called a meeting, and everyone gathered in the square to discuss what could be done. The talk was heated, and no solution seemed to offer any real hope. Amidst the noise, I spotted Bahlol standing at the edge of the crowd, his eyes calm and steady. As the voices grew louder, Bahlol stepped forward, raising his hand to quiet the gathering. For a moment, all was still. Then he spoke. "You've all forgotten what matters," Bahlol said gently, his voice cutting through the tension like a sharp knife. "You're so focused on the problem that you've overlooked the solution standing right before you." The crowd fell silent, waiting for him to continue. Bahlol smiled and pointed to the sky. "The sun rises every day, bringing light and warmth. The earth gives without asking anything in return. And yet, here you are, fighting over something that can be solved by unity, by working together." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If you share what you have, if you help one another, you will find that the problem is not as great as it seems. But if you continue to divide yourselves, the hardship will only grow." It was simple, yet profound. The people listened, and one by one, they began to put aside their differences. The town came together, sharing what little food they had, and working in unison to rebuild what had been lost. It wasn't easy, but it was enough. And through it all, Bahlol was there, offering guidance in the most unexpected ways. Years went by, and Bahlol remained a fixture in our town. His shop stayed open, filled with trinkets and oddities, and his wisdom continued to guide us. But as the years wore on, Bahlol began to grow frail. His movements slowed, and his once vibrant eyes seemed clouded with age. One evening, as I visited him, he looked at me with a quiet smile. "My time is near," he said softly. "But don't mourn for me, my friend. I've lived a full life, and I have shared what I could. It is now your turn to carry the lessons I've taught you." I nodded, not knowing what to say, but Bahlol's smile was all the answer I needed. He had shown me that wisdom was not in grand gestures or complicated theories, but in the simple truths that lay beneath the surface of everyday life. When Bahlol passed away, the town mourned. But his legacy lived on in the hearts of those he had touched. We remembered his lessons, his quiet wisdom, and his ability to see beyond the chaos of the world. And as I grew older, I found myself sharing his stories, passing on his wisdom to the next generation, just as he had done for me. Bahlol had left behind no fortune, no monuments to his name. But his legacy was something far greater. He had shown us that the answers we seek are often simpler than we think, and that true wisdom lies not in knowing all the answers, but in knowing what matters most. I was born in a meadow, soft grass beneath my hooves, the wind in my mane. My mother was a beautiful mare, a creature of grace and strength. She taught me everything I needed to know about the world. I remember the first time I galloped across the field with her beside me, the freedom and the joy filling me as we ran. My mother was gentle but firm, always guiding me, teaching me the ways of the world. The world can be kind, but it can also be harsh. She told me one day as we stood together, watching the sunset over the horizon. Remember to keep your head high, no matter what comes. My early days were filled with peaceful moments, surrounded by other horses who shared the meadow with us. It was a life I would come to cherish, and one that would soon be taken away from me. One fateful day, a man came to our meadow, a tall, well-dressed figure with a commanding presence. He stood there, gazing at the horses, his eyes sharp and calculating. I could sense something was changing, but I did not know what. Without much warning, my mother was sold. I remember the sadness in her eyes as she was led away. The man approached me, his hand on my mane, inspecting me as though I were a mere commodity. He purchased me too, and I was taken from the only life I had known, from the meadow that had been my home, and placed into a world of strangers. The man led me to a stable, and there I met my first owner, Mr. Gordon. He was a kind man, but he seemed distant and preoccupied with his own concerns. His voice was soft, and he treated me with respect, but I could tell he wasn't quite sure how to take care of me. The stable was cold, the air stale and musty. I was given food and water, but the sense of freedom I had once known was slipping away with each passing day. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself pulling a carriage through the streets of the city. The work was hard, and the air was thick with smoke and noise. The people in the city walked by in a hurry, paying no attention to the horses like me, their eyes fixed on their own business. My days were spent pulling heavy loads through crowded streets, the weight of the world pressing down on my shoulders. My feet ached, and my body grew weary, but I had no choice. I had to do as I was told. Mr. Gordon, despite his kindness, did not understand what I needed. He was always too busy with his own affairs, and I was left to toil endlessly, day after day. There were moments when I felt as though I were a part of the machine that kept the city running, a cog in a wheel that never stopped turning. My life had become a routine, one that I had no power to change. Then came a new master, one who would change everything. His name was Squire Gordon, and he was Mr. Gordon's son. He was young and brash, full of energy and impatience. He didn't seem to care much for the welfare of the horses, and I soon found myself under his harsh command. He treated me with little respect, shouting at me when I did not perform perfectly, whipping me when I was slow. My days grew harder under his care, and I began to dread the sight of him. One day, after an especially grueling day of work, I was hit harder than usual. My body trembled from the pain, but there was no sympathy from Squire Gordon. I collapsed in the street, unable to continue, my legs trembling beneath me. The sound of the whip echoed in my ears as I struggled to rise. It was then that I met John Manley, a stable boy who worked at the stable where I was kept. He saw the way Squire Gordon treated me, and it broke his heart. John was different from the others. He had a gentleness in his eyes, a compassion that I had not seen in a long time. He knelt beside me, soothing me with his hands, his voice soft and reassuring. "You're a good horse," he whispered. "You don't deserve this." From that day forward, John became my friend. He would bring me extra oats, give me time to rest, and always make sure that I was treated with care. It was John who showed me what kindness truly looked like in this world. Under his care, I felt the weight of my work lift, if only for a short time. His kindness was a light in the darkness, a moment of peace in a world that had been full of struggle. However, not all was well. Squire Gordon's cruelty continued, and despite John's best efforts to protect me, I could not escape the burden of the work. But there was something else on the horizon. Change was coming. It happened one morning when I was hit particularly hard. I had been pulling a heavy load through the streets, and I had grown weak from the work. My legs were sore, my body was bruised, and my spirit was nearly broken. The heat of the day pressed down on me, and I stumbled once again. This time, though, Squire Gordon wasn't satisfied with just the whip. He took the reins in his hands and yanked them harshly, pulling me up against my will. That's when I heard John's voice calling to me, his words cutting through the noise. He ran toward me, his face full of worry, and I knew in that moment that he would try to stop it. Without thinking, John lunged at Squire Gordon, grabbing the reins and pulling them from his hands. "You can't treat him like this," John shouted, his voice full of anger. "He's not an object. He's a living creature." Squire Gordon recoiled, his face red with fury. "How dare you, boy? Do you know who I am?" John stood his ground, unafraid. "I know exactly who you are," he said, "and you're no better than a common thug." The confrontation was brief but powerful. Squire Gordon left in a huff, muttering about finding another horse to replace me, but I could see the look in his eyes. He had been forced to listen, to see me as something more than just a beast of burden. That was the turning point. John took me under his care more than ever, and with each passing day I grew stronger, more confident. It wasn't long before John arranged for me to be sold to a new master, a kind man who saw my potential and treated me with respect. Under this new master's care, I was given a new life. My days of pulling carriages through the crowded streets were over. I was trained as a riding horse, my spirit beginning to soar once again. I found myself in a beautiful stable, surrounded by other horses who treated me as an equal. The nights were quieter, the days less exhausting. The man who owned me, Mr. Darley, was kind and generous. He spent time with me, spoke to me in a voice that was gentle, and made sure I had the best of care. I was finally in a place where I could be who I was meant to be, strong, proud, and free. The work was still demanding, but it was a different kind of work. I was no longer a tool to be used, but a companion, a trusted partner. I was trained for races, running swiftly across the fields, the wind in my mane, the freedom of the open space filling me with joy. I felt alive in a way I had not known in years. As the years passed, I became a legend in the racing world. I had always been one to collect things, small trinkets and treasures that seemed insignificant to others, but held meaning to me. My collection started innocently enough when I was a child. Rocks, shells, old buttons, and coins I found lying around my neighborhood. Each item held a story, a memory, something that made it special. I would spend hours carefully arranging them, sorting them by size, shape, and color, as though the act of organizing gave them more value than they already had. My parents didn't quite understand my obsession, but they didn't stop me either, letting me indulge in my small rituals of gathering, fascinated by how something so small could bring me so much joy. As I grew older, my collection expanded. It started with postcards from places I had never visited, each one a piece of someone else's world. Then came stamps, old keys from junk shops, buttons from forgotten coats, and little figurines I found at yard sales. My room became a maze of shelves filled with these oddities, and each item had a place, a meaning, a reason for being there. I loved showing my collection to my friends, their eyes lighting up with surprise as they looked through the objects I had gathered. Some thought it was silly, others thought it was fascinating, but to me, it was just a way to hold on to things that might otherwise slip away. It wasn't just physical objects that I collected, though. I collected stories, too. Stories I overheard from strangers in cafes, whispered among old friends, and even the ones that floated through the air like fleeting thoughts. My mind was a repository for everything, a vast collection of moments, and I often found myself lost in these fragments of lives that weren't mine. I would recount them to myself, turning them over in my mind, trying to uncover their deeper meaning, understanding them like pieces of a puzzle. I didn't know why I collected them. It wasn't as though I had any intention of sharing them. They were mine to keep, tucked away like all the objects that filled my shelves. Years passed, and my collection grew even larger. I started traveling, seeking out new objects to add to my assortment, each new place offering its own unique set of treasures. I scoured antique stores in distant towns, dug through flea markets, and explored abandoned buildings in search of the perfect item. The thrill of finding something that no one else had was indescribable. Sometimes I would find a cracked porcelain doll hidden in a forgotten box in the back of a store. Other times, it was an old pocket watch buried in the dirt of a long-neglected yard. These objects weren't just things. They were pieces of history, fragments of the past that whispered their stories to me. It wasn't until I visited the old house on the hill that my collection took on a new direction. The house was a crumbling relic of a bygone era, filled with dust and cobwebs, but there was something about it that called to me. I had heard rumors of the house for years, stories of its previous owners and the strange, mysterious things they left behind. No one had dared to go inside for decades, but something inside me told me I had to see it for myself. I pushed open the heavy door, the creak of the wood echoing through the silence. The house seemed to breathe, alive with secrets. Inside, I found room after room filled with forgotten items, relics of a life lived long ago. Old books, faded paintings, and once glorious furniture now rotting away in the dampness of time. But it was in the attic that I found what I was truly searching for. Boxes upon boxes of old photographs, yellowed and brittle with age. I carefully opened the first box, my hands trembling with anticipation. Inside were pictures of families I didn't recognize, of places I had never seen, all trapped in the frames of time. I felt an overwhelming sense of connection to these strangers, as though their lives had somehow intertwined with mine through the simple act of collecting their memories. I spent hours in that attic, sorting through the photographs, the faded letters, and the small personal items that had been left behind. It was as though I was uncovering the lost history of the house, collecting the forgotten pieces of its past. I couldn't bring myself to leave without taking something with me, something to remember this discovery by. I carefully packed a small box of the photographs and letters, determined to preserve these lives in my own collection. But as I made my way down the stairs, I noticed something strange, a small wooden box on the floor, hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers. I bent down and opened it, my heart racing. Inside the box was a collection of strange, intricate objects, coins, buttons, and a small, delicate key. But there was something else too, something that made my skin prickle with unease. A small, worn piece of paper, folded and tucked carefully beneath the items. I unfolded it slowly, the words on the paper scribbled in a hurried hand. It read, "Beware the things you collect, for they will collect you." The words struck me like a bolt of lightning, and for a moment I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I had spent my entire life collecting things, gathering memories and objects that held meaning to no one but me. But now, as I stood in that attic, the weight of those words seemed to press down on me. What did they mean? And why did I feel as though I had stumbled upon something much bigger than I had ever anticipated? I left the house that day, clutching the box of photographs and the strange note in my hands. The feeling of unease lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me as I walked back to my car. The collection I had spent my life building suddenly felt less like a hobby and more like an obsession, a dangerous compulsion that had taken root deep within me. I wondered if it had always been this way, if I had been collecting these things not out of a love for them, but out of some deeper, more inexplicable need. As the days passed, I found myself unable to stop thinking about that note. I returned to the house several times, hoping to uncover more clues, but each time I left empty-handed, the eerie sensation growing stronger with each visit. My dreams were filled with the objects I had collected over the years. Old coins, weathered photographs, and strange trinkets that seemed to come to life in the darkness. I began to feel as though my collection was no longer mine, as though it was slowly taking control of me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. One night, I found myself standing in front of my shelves, staring at the countless items I had gathered over the years. The little porcelain figurines, the coins from distant lands, the postcards from forgotten places. They all seemed to be watching me, waiting. My breath quickened, and I took a step back, realizing for the first time that I had become a part of my collection. I was no longer the collector, I was the collected. I started to throw things away, to give away the objects I had so carefully gathered over the years, but it was impossible. No matter how many times I tried, something always stopped me, a deep, inexplicable pull that kept me clinging to the things I had accumulated. I felt as though I was being drawn into an endless cycle, one where I could never escape the compulsion to collect, to gather, to hold on to everything.